When God pulls you away from what you thought was love, not every departure is a loss sometimes. It is heaven pulling you by the hand gently, but firmly away from something you are still calling love, while it was slowly killing your soul. Have you ever been taken out of a relationship so abruptly it felt like a storm had ripped through your life? Have you mourned someone who broke you, and still, against all logic, you miss them? That is not weakness, that is the echo of a battle between your soul and your spirit. One remembers the affection, the other remembers the captivity. You are not alone in this. There's a kind of warfare so subtle it hides behind charm, behind promises, behind "I'm sorry." It weaves itself into your daily rhythm and calls itself normal. But God sees what no one else does. And when the moment comes, He separates not with noise, but with purpose. You didn't just lose someone. Heaven removed what was working against your destiny. The narcissist wasn't simply a bad relationship. They were a spiritual trap designed to silence, confuse, and dismantle the core of who you are. This message is not just about recovery, it's about revelation. Because what God has removed, He will not allow to return, and what He's judged, He will no longer bless. Going back could cost you more than you realize, not just your peace, but your place in His greater purpose. In this teaching, we'll explore why separation is often protection in disguise, how the wilderness is not rejection, but restoration, what spiritual forces hide behind narcissistic personality, is why returning to a narcissist is more than emotional relapse, it's spiritual risk, and how God is raising you into something far greater than survival. You're not forgotten. You're not forsaken. You're being rebuilt. Let's begin one. When God separates, it's not abandonment, it's rescue. There comes a moment in every believer's life when the voice of God doesn't sound like a whisper of peace. It sounds like a rupture, a door slams shut, a relationship falls apart, someone you once trusted walks away, and your soul, stunned and bleeding, asks the age old question: God, where are you in this? But heaven does not answer with explanations. It answers with protection. What you called rejection, God called rescue. What He saw as heartbreak, God saw as intervention. There are moments when God does not negotiate with your preferences. He intervenes for your survival. And when the person He removes is a narcissist, charming on the outside but hollow and dangerous within, his actions may seem sudden, even cruel, but in reality, He is pulling you from a slow spiritual death. You didn't leave on your own. God separated you not because He was tired of your prayers, but because your prayers had finally reached a depth that required divine action. You asked Him to deliver you from confusion, from pain, from constant guilt, from emotional chaos, and so He did. But the answer came in the form of separation, not restoration. And that is why your heart didn't recognize it as mercy. He was still calling it love. You are still trying to redeem what heaven had already rejected. And when God closed the door, you stood outside weeping, thinking He had forsaken you, when in truth, He had just saved you. The narcissist didn't just damage your emotions, they blurred your spiritual compass. They taught you to doubt yourself, to apologize for existing, to walk on eggshells while calling it love. Their affection was a tool, that charm a weapon, and their promises a prison with golden bars. And God, your Father, your defender, your shepherd, had seen enough, so He tore it away gently but firmly, and it hurt, because the soul doesn't always know the difference between intimacy and bondage until it is separated by force. You may have cried, Lord, why did you let them go? But what if heaven replied, child, Why did you stay so long? Sometimes we misinterpret God's silence in the moment of separation as absence, but it is not absence, it is operation. Heaven moves in silence when it's doing surgery, and what God separated you from, He did so for your healing, not your home. You are tied to someone who knew how to manipulate emotion, spiritual language, and even your faith. And though the world saw a relationship, heaven saw a soul tie forged in control and fear. So God broke it because you could not fulfill your purpose while chained to the very voice that distorted your identity. This is not the ending of love, it is the beginning of clarity. It is the dismantling of an illusion, one that kept you small, unsure, and spiritually stunted. God loved you too much to let that continue. So, yes, it felt like tearing. Yes, it felt like being dropped. But the hands that let you for were the same hands that lifted you from slavery. Because sometimes what looks like falling is really being pulled out of what was sinking. Let this be the moment you stop calling your separation a tragedy. It was a strategy, devised by the one who sees all, knows all, and refuses to let your calling be aborted by emotional captivity. He didn't walk away, you were rescued to. The silence after separation isn't loneliness, it's God's most tender strategy. After the storm of separation, what often follows is not relief, it's silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels unnerving. It's the quiet that settles over your home when the constant messages, phone calls, manipulations, and emotional highs and lows of all cease. At first, it might feel like a strange kind of emptiness. You sit alone with your thoughts and wonder if you've done something wrong. You wonder if maybe you misunderstood what God was doing. Maybe you made a mistake. Maybe walked away too soon, or worse, maybe God walked away from you. But, beloved, let me tell you something with holy certainty. God has not left you. He has simply entered the room in a way you're not used to recognizing, because when you have lived too long under the weight of someone else's control, especially the manipulative, self centered patterns of a narcissist, your soul begins to equate noise with connection and conflict with passion and even chaos with love. And so when heaven finally intervenes and pulls you out of that relational storm, you expect to be ushered straight into peace and clarity. But instead, God does something completely counterintuitive. He silences everything. You see, the narcissist wasn't just a relational problem, they were a spiritual disruption. And once God removed their access to your life, his first act is not to give you explanations or emotional closure. His first act is to restore order in your inner sanctuary. That requires stillness, that requires quiet, not because God has nothing to say, but because you've been listening to too many voices for too long, and now he's giving your heart a chance to unlearn the lies it has memorized. The voice of the narcissist lingers even after they're gone. Their words replay in your mind. You're too sensitive. No one else will ever love you like I did. You're always overreacting. These words became the internal narrator of your life. They shaped your decisions, your moods, even your sense of worth. They were repeated so often you began to believe them, not just as accusations, but as identity. And that's why God leads you into the wilderness, because the wilderness is where He begins to confront every false name you've ever answered to. It's where he teaches you how to hear his voice again, not in competition with theirs, but in the absence of all others. This season of silence is not punishment, it is sacred space. It is spiritual recovery. God is not pushing you away, He is drawing you close without interference. He's laying your soul down in still waters so that He may restore it, and restoration does not happen in crowds. He doesn't have any noise. It happens in the secret place where your heart has no audience and God has no rival. But here's the danger in the silence. The temptation to go back becomes very real because you've forgotten the pain, but because the pain was familiar, and what is familiar often feels safer than what is unknown. The people of Israel, even after being miraculously delivered from slavery in Egypt, began to long for the very chains that once enslaved them. Why? Because freedom is terrifying when you've only ever known captivity, because the wilderness felt disorienting, because in Egypt at least they knew what to expect, and so they said, let us go back. That same spirit whispers to you. No, it tells you that maybe things weren't so bad, that maybe you overreacted, that maybe if you pray harder, love better, wait longer, things will change. But hear me, with all the urgency of the spirit, going back would not restore. Oh, you, it would ruin Slavia. The silence you are sitting in is not absence, it is strategy. It is God cutting the final cords of soul ties you didn't even know was still attached. It is God preparing the soil of your heart so that when His voice finally speaks again, it won't be drowned out by memories of manipulation. You may feel alone, but you are not abandoned. You are in the hands of the great physician, and He is doing surgery on wounds that can't be seen with human eyes. He is healing the part of you that thought chaos was normal, that love was earned through suffering, that worth had to be negotiated daily. He is saying, you are mine, I have set you apart, and I'm not done with you. Let this be your reassurance. God doesn't lead people into silence to forget them. He leads them into silence to reintroduce Himself, to show you that your identity was never found in their approval, to remind you that your value is not based on how well you performed under pressure. He is not a God who whispers sweet nothings, He declares eternal truths. And in this sacred quiet, He is restoring your name, your purpose, and your inner peace. So don't despise this silence. Don't rush to fill it. Don't reach for the phone or the old photos or the memories that lead you back into cycles God has already broken. Sit in the stillness, listen, cry if you must, but let God finish what He started. Because when He has done, the silence that once felt like loneliness will become the holy ground where your soul was finally reborn. If this silence is where you are right now, say these words aloud or write them in faith. God, I will not run from this silence. Heal me here. Let this be your altar. Let this be your turning point. Because you are not in exile, you are in transformation. And when the silence lifts, you will not be the same. 3. The narcissist was not your assignment, they were heaven's alarm. There is a sacred danger in confusing spiritual compassion with spiritual obligation. Many believers, especially those with tender hearts and a sincere desire to love like Christ, fall into the trap of thinking they were sent to fix the brokenness in others, especially those who wear the mask of need but carry the spirit of control. This confusion becomes even more dangerous when the person in question is a narcissist. They do not present themselves as a threat, they present themselves as a project. And in the name of empathy, you volunteer to become their rescue. But what if I told you that you were never called to carry that assignment, that the narcissist in your life wasn't a soul you were meant to save, but a signal heaven allowed to awaken you? What if they were not sent by God to draw you into a purpose, but permitted to reveal what still lived in your soul? The desire to be loved at any cost, even when the cost was your own identity. You see a narcissist as not enter your life empty handed. They come carrying charisma words dipped in false humility, the appearance of spiritual hunger, and a need that flat as your deepest longings to be chosen, to be needed, to be special. And when they notice your sensitivity, your ability to forgive, your longing to see the good in others, they see an opening not because you are weak, but because you are good. And in the twisted logic of the narcissistic spirit, goodness is a resort to be exploited at first. It may feel like a divine connection. They say all the right things, they quote scripture, they share their trauma, they express deep need for understanding, for grace, for someone who won't give up on them. And because your heart is shaped by the gospel, you stay through the first signs of manipulation, telling yourself is just insecurity. You stay after the gaslighting begins, calling it emotional immaturity. You stay after the anger, the withdrawal, the sudden warmth followed by ice, because you believe love is patient and kind. You stay even when your spirit begins to whisper something is not right, but what you interpret as ministry. Heaven interprets as a compromise, because slowly, without realizing it, you begin to give parts of yourself that only belong to God. Your peace becomes negotiable, your time, your clarity, your sense of direction, all slowly absorbed by their emotional gravity. And by the time you realize what has happened, you are no longer offering support, you are sacrificed. This is how the enemy operates when he cannot take your faith. He targets your compassion, he weaponizes your goodness, and turns your gift for empathy into a tool of bondage. But God sees what you do not, and because He is not only your shepherd, but also your defender, He allows the pressure to increase. He lets the mask slip. He permits the charm to fade, and then He pulls the veil from your eyes and shows you what you've really been fighting, not a person, but a pattern. Not a relationship, but a soul entangling stronghold, a spirit that feeds on your strength while convincing you that you're too fragile to leave. And so God intervenes, not in the way you imagined, not with instant healing or the other person's transformation. He intervenes by removing you, by shaking everything that isn't rooted in truth, by stripping away the false peace you made with chaos, and suddenly what looked like rejection becomes rescue, what felt like loss becomes deliverance, because the narcissist wasn't just draining your heart, they were delaying your destiny. There is no coincidence in spiritual warfare. The timing of the relationship, the intensity of the connection, the confusion that followed the gradual erosion of your faith in yourself and your discernment, these were not mere signs of a difficult person. They were indicators of spiritual warfare. This I does emotional intimacy. But now that God has exposed it, He expects you to treat it as what it is, a battle that was never yours to carry. The narcissist was not your calling, they were your crossroads. They were not your future, they were your wake up call. And though your heart may still ill ache and your mind may still search for meaning, your spirit knows the truth. God did not give you to them. He used them to reveal what He needed to free you from. Because sometimes the greatest revelations don't come in moments of worship or visions of glory. They come through the ache of disappointment, through the heartbreak that finally snaps the thread of delusion, through the slow and painful realization that you are never responsible for their healing. You are only responsible for your obedience. The narcissist may have appeared as your mission, but they were heaven's alarm, a loud, disruptive, inescapable call that said you are in danger way. A cop, get out, let me deliver you. And now the alarm has stopped, the house is empty, the storm has passed. What remains is not just grief, it is ground reclaimed, ground where God will soon build something new, something lasting, something untainted by lies or manipulation. But first, you must recognize this truth. You were never called to be their savior, you were called to be free for. Returning to what God delivered you from is more than a mistake, it's a spiritual violation. One of the most dangerous temptations after a divine separation is the desire to return, and not always physically sometimes. It's just in memory and daydreams and silent what ifs with. But in the midnight hour, the pain of being alone, the disorientation of healing the long nights without answers, these moments create a strange longing, not for what was good, but for what was familiar. There was something deceptive about pain. When it becomes patent, it begins to feel normal. It becomes woven into your emotional DNA. And suddenly, absence feels more threatening than abuse. Loneliness feels more suffocating than manipulation. And before you even realize it, your soul starts to romanticize bondage, not because you forgot the truth, but because the wilderness feels too quiet, too slow, too unknown. And it is in this silence that the enemy begins his whisper campaign. There's maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe they've changed. Maybe you misjudged them. Misheard God, maybe you gave up too soon. These are not innocent thoughts. They are invitations to return to what God has already judged. They are spiritual suggestions designed to bait your heart back into captivity because the enemy knows something many believers forget: God does not separate lightly. He does not tear soul ties just to teach you a lesson. He does it because what you were tied to was actively working against the future he ordained for you. To go back after such a separation is not simply emotional regression, it is a violation of spiritual protection. It is, in essence, to rebuild what God has demolished, to reach for what heaven has removed, to desire what heaven has condemned. And the cost is always high than before, because when God delivers, he removes not only the person, but the grace that once covered your ignorance. Before, you didn't know the depth of the danger. You didn't fully understand what was operating behind the smile, the tears, the apologies. You gave benefit of the doubt. You hoped, you endured, you prayed. But now you see clearly now. The veil has been lifted now. The discernment has been given. And to walk back into the same space is to do so without divine covering. This is why God's word to Lot's wife was so severe: do not look back. It wasn't just about glancing over her shoulder, it was about posture, it was about loyalty, it was about where her heart still belonged. She had left the city, but the city had not left her. And when her soul reached for what God had already condemned, she became frozen, paralyzed in the very posture of divided loyalty. The same danger exists for anyone who flirts with the past God has already destroyed. The moment you long for Egypt, you disqualify yourself from entering Canaan, not because God no longer loves you, but because the mindset of bondage cannot inherit the promise of freedom. There is no compromise between healing and captivity. There is no halfway between obedience and nostalgia. And there is no blessing in returning to what wounded your soul. This is not just about a person. This is about alignment, about covenant, about honoring the clarity God gave you. When he tore you out of that place, you may still feel connected. That's natural. Soul ties linger. Trauma bonds don't snap clean. But healing is not a feeling. The decision And that decision must be reinforced in the lonely moments, the tired moments, the moments when you feel like nothing has moved forward since the separation. You must remind yourself that silence is not failure. That slowness is not a sign to return, that the absence of affection is not an invitation to reopen a door God shut with thunder, because if you go back, you will not just lose your progress. You will forfeit something sacred: your peace, your clarity, your sense of spiritual safety. God does not operate on sentiment, He operates on truth. And truth is not always gentle to your emotions, but it is faithful to your destiny. The person He removed may still know how to speak your language. They may still reach out, still play on your compassion, still mirror your face, your fears, your values. But you must remember, a good performance is not the same as a good heart. They may have changed their words, but not their spirit. They may have altered their tone, but not their pattern. And you must protect your freedom with everything you've got, because the cost of returning is not measured in comfort, it's measured in calling. And your calling is too sacred. Why?